Well, we have a lot of speakers and we have a lot to talk about, so I think we'll just begin. Maybe just check outside, be sure people are here. While we're settling in, remind people to please turn off electronic communication devices. And I'll mention a couple of upcoming events. Next Monday at noon, Mark Katz from George Mason University will speak on Russian policy in the Greater Middle East. On May 17th, Ralph Mowat-Larson from the Kennedy School at Harvard will speak about Russian-American intelligence cooperation. And on Monday, May 24th at noon, these are all noon discussions, Ellen Roskam from the Institute of International Development Studies in Geneva will speak about health systems reform in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. I also want to mention that we have a half-day conference examining separation of powers in Russia and Ukraine and comparative perspective. There'll be speakers from Germany and from Brazil as well, and that will be Tuesday, May 18th throughout the afternoon. Well, today I have the considerable pleasure of welcoming back a former Woodrow Wilson Center Fellow, Gulben Elzan, who is here to present her new book, Building States and Markets, Enterprise Development in Central Asia. They are on sale, and hopefully you'll be so moved by the presentation you won't worry about the price, which is a little bit high.
Right, I agree.
But anyway, the book is here. She is Reader in International Business and Entrepreneurship in the School of Management at Royal Holloway, University of London. She's an expert evaluator for the European Commission and research director of the Gurukul Global Leadership Program at the London School of Economics. She's received numerous awards, the Wilson Center Fellowship, the Robert McNamara Fellowship at the World Bank, and she's author of several books, and she's working on a new monograph, even as this one is just coming out, and that work will examine the political economy of Central Asia. After she presents the book, we'll hear from three commentators. Henry Hale, who is director of the Institute of European, Russian, Eurasian Studies at George Washington University and a former Title VIII supported research scholar here at the Kennan Institute. He's taught at Indiana, the European University of St. Petersburg, and the Fletcher School at Tufts prior to joining the GW faculty, and he's presently completing work on the politics of regime change in Eurasia. Barbara Jonesby is presently a research scholar, also supported by Title VIII here at the Kennan Institute, and she's working on the political significance of financial industrial groups in Kazakhstan. And she's also examining the press in authoritarian post-Soviet Central Asia. And Erica Murat will be the third commentator. She's a social science expert on military, national, and regional defense, and she's published widely since earning her doctoral degree in political science at the University of Bremen. And her book, which came out last year and is receiving positive reviews, is entitled The Military and the State in Central Asia. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Blair. Thanks to the Wilson Center and the Kennan Institute for organizing this event. I also would like to express my deep, sincere gratitude to my co-panelists for agreeing to be on the panel and reviewing the book. It's great to be back and see so many friends here. I would like to start with a passage from the book on Kyrgyzstan, since it has been recently in the news. Kyrgyzstan symbolizes a phenomenon where the state is dissolved in the markets with periodic clashes among its major groups. The divided loyalties of the strategic elite, coupled with weak state institutions and security apparatus, have led to the growth of powerful and occasionally armed alternative governments. Market penetration became the key source of power and legitimacy for political elites. Different interests and self-governing groups penetrated the state apparatus and deepened conflictual relations. This led to a highly unstable and chaotic state-market relationship. Initially, state organs partitioned among the ruling elite dissolved into the markets through privatization and liberal economic policies that were introduced by the former president, Askar Akayev. This process continued, albeit with increased authoritarian tendencies under his successor, Kurmanbek Bakiyev. Since last month, we can see perhaps that similar issues will face the Bakiyev's successors. Not only does the presidential family and its regional allies control all the major assets in the economy, but the state's provision of public goods is severely damaged and handicapped by this regime. At the same time, deep regional loyalties and growing influence of self-governing syndicates began to exert power over the state apparatus while co-opting its bureaucratic elite. Competing patronage networks nourish alternative power centers that periodically challenge the authority of the state and the hierarchy. Now, after this short fragment, I would like to move on to main premises of the book and mention about my main findings and provide you a brief conclusion. First of all, I would like to place my book in the emerging literature on Central Asia. Scholarly studies on post-Soviet Central Asia has been growing slowly. These mainly fall into three categories: cultural and political studies, international and strategic studies, and the economics of transition. Collins's work on clan politics, long study on regionalism and decentralization, Khalid's analysis on Islam provide important avenues for researchers and policymakers. My co-panelists have contributed significantly to our understanding of political realities of the region as well. In the second group, Olcott, Cummings, and others show us the region's trajectory in the global scene. Finally, macroeconomic analyses and political economy frameworks have shown the region's path towards capitalist markets under new independent statehood. Monographs of Pomfret, Gleason, and Swetzler among those important contributions. This literature is quite interesting, but it misses out some big questions that I have taken up and tried to address in my book. What are the tangible experiences of people going through the dynamic overhaul of Soviet economic structures? The lack of scholarly interest in social differentiation in transition from Soviet structures to capitalist markets is especially striking. The evolving social stratification in relation to property ownership, the distribution of economic and political resources, and changing value systems clearly deserve much more attention from scholars as well as policymakers. The transition literature has been mute about the emerging entrepreneurial class and its implications on the future direction of Central Asia. Who are these new property owners? What kind of social and economic role do they play? How do they interact with new authoritarian state structures and other capitalists? To what extent do they form a cohesive group? And what forms of capitalism can prevail in this region? In my book, I address these questions by focusing on the emerging entrepreneurial middle stratum. My analysis unravels the social, moral, and political character of the new middle stratum entrepreneurs based on empirical evidence gathered from Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan over the past 7 years. Now, the methodology of my book is rooted in empirical work. The book's main scholarly perspective is rooted in economic geography and the sociology of entrepreneurship, although I benefited greatly from historical, ethnographic, and political science-based research. A wide range of sources, such as travel accounts and journalistic reports, were useful as well. I collected my primary evidence between 2004 and 2007 and was assisted by grants and logistical help from a range of institutions, including the Nuffield Foundation, the Leverhulme Trust, the Woodrow Wilson Center, EBRD, USAID, Turkish International Trade Council, and several universities in the region. I studied over 200 mainly small and medium-sized businesses throughout the region. This took me to the lives of ordinary people and entrepreneurs, and I had many interesting experiences, many memorable events. Once we got lost while looking for a touristic site in Kyrgyzstan and had to sleep in the car till in the morning. Another time we were abandoned by our driver in the middle of Soviet industrial complex. Once I visited a couple who got microfinance and butchered animal parts to sell in the market, which had horrific smell. We had to go out to carry out our interview. It was very memorable and interesting experience for me. I carried out semi-structured interviews with a few dozen artisan merchants in Fergana Valley towns of Uzbekistan. I gained further insight to the realities of the region by talking to a broad range of people. I interviewed opposition leaders, such as the leader of Akjol in Kazakhstan, Bulat Abilov, the leader of exiled Uzbek opposition, Birlik Muhammad Salih, and one of the Kyrgyz opposition leaders, Temir Sariev, now the finance minister of the current interim government. Talking to scores of civil servants, diplomats, academics, ordinary people, as well as local and international experts helped me to develop a large picture and learn about diverse views and realities of this region. Let me now turn to conceptual and theoretical framework of the book. Here we have a situation whereby an entire society has moved away from common ownership. A large number of assets are dissolved. The command economy collapsed. Dreams of transition to free market capitalism have been revealed to be an illusion. While there has been a degree of continuity of the Soviet elite retaining power and wealth, a diverging pattern of oligarchic and chaotic reallocation regimes began to shape new ownership and opportunity structures. During the past 2 decades, former Soviet bureaucrats and their counterparts benefited most from privatization and enterprise development. But many others lost their former status and sunk into the morass of the new lower stratum. Soviet professionals, writers, managers, and officials have shrunk in prestige as their political influence and economic status diminished or disappeared. A new, more differentiated and more polarized social strata emerged under a sort of capitalist regime of accumulation and control by old party bosses and new economic elites. The emergence of an entrepreneurial middle class is the most distinct outcome of this stratification. I developed a conceptual approach to analyze the dynamics of state-market relationships and social stratification. And I used the analogy of the game of pick-up sticks to represent the rounds of allocation and reappropriation that repeatedly occur in these economies. A slightly more sophisticated pick-up sticks is also called and known as Mikado game. And this is the term I use in the book. This game involves 5 different parties with diverse endowments and ambitions. In Central Asia, these 5 parties are the presidents with their ruling families and associates, the oligarchs and courtiers, the proteges and apparatchiks, the middle entrepreneurial class, and the unprivileged. Now, I'm not going to go through in detail to each group, but I'm going to give you a snapshot about the entrepreneurial middle class. The middle class stratum consists of the emerging entrepreneurial class and the shrinking number of professional salaried workers. The rapid growth of the indigenous middle class took place during the later stages of the Soviet Union. A significant portion of the urban middle classes were formed by Slavs and Europeans. And with their departure, professional and administrative positions were depleted. The private sector is not extensive enough to provide middle-class lifestyles for most who aspire to it. The former intelligentsia has disintegrated, and the character of professional life has changed dramatically. In Uzbekistan, the most numerous middle-class wage earners are those in the security forces and army officers, along with civil servants in the bloated bureaucracy of the Karimov regime. In Kazakhstan, the police and the army are almost insignificant, although there have been attempts to institutionalize it and modernize it. The most significant growth among wage earners has been in banking, financial services, and the private sector. Professionals and senior civil servants are also being nurtured through scholarships to study abroad. The most serious depletion in civil service and professional positions took place in Kyrgyzstan as the economy shrunk. Entrepreneurs thus formed the most numerous and important group in new middle class. Although they are not the direct beneficiaries of major privatization programs, entrepreneurs are residual beneficiaries of the dissolution of Soviet enterprises and land privatization. They constantly negotiate to solidify their domain and expand market opportunities. Many professionals and civil servants are also engaged in entrepreneurial activities in a fashion similar to household bartering during the Soviet era. Unofficial business comes in many forms. In addition to outright graft, many officials, as well as shady entrepreneurs, run protection rackets. Various forms of self-governing syndicates flourished across the region. These syndicates are amorphous groups often run by a charismatic leader with significant economic and political assets and commonly call upon the persuasive powers of armed men. They were initially regularly employed by the oligarchs for business protection. However, over the years, they have expanded their influence and function as versatile facilitators and power brokers. Many of these groups provide social externalities by reducing the propensity for anarchy. This can be seen as public good, along with the employment they provide to otherwise unemployable youth. Now, let me turn to the rounds of allocation in the Mikado game. The success of entrepreneurial middle stratum depends on the mobility and steady expansion of opportunities in a dynamic relationship with the other social strata. However, there is a fine balance. The system depends on the maintenance of rules of behavior and sequence of moves. The players need to ensure the stability is preserved as they reallocate resources. In the Mikado game, parties have hopeful expectations from each round. And in Central Asian hierarchies, a similar dynamic mollifies potential discontent. While pressure groups, civil society organizations, and multi-party politics articulate group interests in most democracies, such channels, which are either blocked or non-existent in post-Soviet societies, are accommodated within the Mikado game. Thus, in the real world of Central Asian markets and politics, diverse interests find channels to penetrate into reallocation regimes without any formal political representation. Social stratification rests on expanding opportunities through the repositioning of courtiers, protégés, and others. One mechanism is to reshuffle the upper tiers upper tiers who guard the redistribution mechanisms and extract most benefits, economic as well as political. The reshuffling often limits the power of established groups, widens the scope of opportunities to new cadres, and changes the direction of reallocation regimes to new loyal groups. President Nazarbayev and his courtiers have been the most entrepreneurial and imaginative in employing reshuffling techniques without hampering the growth of opportunities in other strata. Their major advantage over neighboring countries is their rich resource base. The Kazakh upper strata are comprised of both old and new cadres, including a growing number of young professionals and foreign educated experts. Because the Kazakh economy has been growing, each stratum is expanding, and there are new opportunities for vertical movement. In the much smaller economy of Kyrgyzstan, political contests generate some mobility and opportunities. The Mikado game is played somewhat differently in Uzbekistan. The loyal cadres of the Kerimov regime restrict mobility and purposely retain a large gap between higher and lower strata. Security forces and state employees enforce the rules of a rigid game. Market relations are controlled by the Kerimov's courtiers, as well as hidden proteges, and his family control the economy along with a few oligarchs. This structure rests on interdependency among oligarchs to ensure economic stability in the nation as a whole while extracting monopoly rents. The oligarchs need the state's protection to continue their domination in specific sectors with no external competition. Thus, two parties hold each other hostages. In this structure, the proteges and courtiers are highly dependent on the entrepreneurial middle class for social stability and income generation. So, for example, a provincial governor knows that the state budget is insufficient to provide basic necessities and must rely directly on entrepreneurs' efforts that he can manipulate. Otherwise, his position as well as social stability are threatened. In some ways, Uzbekistan's Mikado game is most true to the rules of the game. It is an almost entirely closed system, where the state acts as a rentier at the expense of economic benefits that would otherwise enrich the country. In the normal functioning of a Mikado game, players extract and accumulate their sticks until the system is disturbed, whereupon the opportunity moves to another player. When the pile becomes too unstable and collapses, a new round is forced. Such a collapse occurred in Kyrgyzstan in 2005, and again last month. The players failed to agree on how to generate new opportunities, and the structure of allocation regimes became unstable. President Akayev failed to use coercive powers to stop the Tulip Revolution, and it is one measure of President Bakiyev's incompetence that he was not able to build up coercive forces in more than 4 years of being in power. So, when he tried to employ force, his minions were able to slaughter many protesters, but quickly revealed their incapability. So we saw that years after Akayev's overthrow, the upper echelons of Kyrgyzstan have yet to initiate the next round of their Mikado game, and until they do, the country will lack the legitimacy and stability that the rules of the game provide. As we have seen in all three countries, the stability of social stratification and the rules of its Mikado game rest on three critical mechanisms. These are competition and compromise, coalition and cadre retention, and finally, repression and exile. First, both within each stratum and among them, there are constant negotiations to shape competition and to reach compromise. For example, oligarchs and courtiers often compete against one another and set their boundaries in the market according to each other and the ruling family, but engage in complex negotiations at the same time. Similarly, middle-class entrepreneurs defend their positions through negotiated competition. Solidarity networks and clans facilitate bargaining and bring new opportunities. Patronage networks and clans also offer protection for small players. Local resources such as housing and public services, as well as new market opportunities, are distributed within social networks through the mechanisms of negotiated competition. The second critical component of durability is coalition and cadre retention. Many of the core cadres in Uzbek and Kazakh state administration had either worked closely with Presidents Nazarbayev and Karimov in the pre-1991 period or have extended loyal clan or family relations. Others seem to have been chosen because of the networks, knowledge, and experience they amassed or opportunities they brought into the Mikado game. Other critical qualities include the specialized knowledge and international contacts. Cadre retention and political coalitions rest on personal and network trust and mutual loyalty. These are shared among individuals rather than institutions. Trust emerges through reciprocal beneficial relations and enhances the ability of networks to forge new transactions, leading to enduring personal relationships. Finally, repression and exile protect the interests of the players against deviators and the growth of alternative power bases. This allocation mechanism is exclusively controlled by the two upper strata. This appears in three forms, depending on the scale of vested interests in all three Central Asian states. First, major problems are addressed through cabinet reshuffles and changes of prime ministers. This aims to disrupt the establishment of any opposition base by alternative groups. The second method is to destabilize political opponents and oligarchs, including foreign investors, through changing business laws, political pressures, or most frequently and easily through accusations of tax evasion and embezzlement. Periodically dismissing and publicly embarrassing governors, chief officials, and other protégés is also a frequently addressed reshuffling technique. These maneuvers are often displayed to the public as a fight against corruption and bad management. The third method is total elimination through political conspiracy charges, imprisonment, exile, or even murder. These three forms of political retunings exist in all countries to varying degrees. These methods are also employed laterally within the upper strata by protégés and courtiers against their own rivals, using their influence in the judiciary, security services, and elsewhere in the bureaucracy. Infighting takes place in many forms, but the main prize is to gain favor with the president, his powerful allies, and relatives. The president's authority and the cohesion among his courtiers reduce the chances of all-out wars, and this cohesion limits the frictions among competing courtiers and protégés. Although business interest allocation tends to be volatile and unpredictable, any large-scale battle requires the permission of the top stratum. Family infighting, conflict of interests among oligarchs, and power-building mechanisms carry constant tension, as seen in the case of daughters and sons-in-law of the Kazakh and Uzbek presidents. Now, briefly, I will turn to some of the main empirical findings of the book. Earlier, I asked who these entrepreneurs are and what kind of enterprising activities they are involved in. The middle stratum entrepreneurs are typically members of former Soviet professional cadres. These groups have multi-ethnic and urban character with high educational attainments. They were doctors, engineers, school teachers, and managers during the Soviet era. The emerging entrepreneurial stratum is concentrated in sectors such as foodstuffs and consumer goods retailing and services, where there are low entry barriers. These businesses form a long tail, extending from medium-sized businesses with specialized assets and growing market share to personally managed micro-businesses. While the upper end of this tail is inevitably connected to the ruling elite, the lower-end entrepreneurs survive by scavenging through the rubble at the margins of the market. Almost 60% of all entrepreneurs surveyed have university education. This high educational attainment is associated with the middle-class character of entrepreneurs across Central Asia. Others come from artisanal backgrounds, though from rural communities. There are significant differences among the countries in relation to educational attainments. My statistical tests show that entrepreneurs are more likely to have high educational attainments in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. In terms of their relationship to the state institutions and judiciary, there is a highly problematic situation. Only 1 out of 183 business owners who answered structured survey reported that the judiciary in their country is very good. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan portrays deep dissatisfaction. None of the respondents rated their legal system and judiciary as very good. Low levels of satisfaction with the judiciary and the legal system stem from partial and arbitrary law enforcement in each country. Since the overwhelming majority of entrepreneurs do not trust the justice system and try to avoid courts in addressing their business and personal problems, any smooth operation of market transition is always problematic and creates economic inefficiencies. Entrepreneurs see that arbitration, taxation, corruption, and poor legal protection hamper their businesses. While the majority of entrepreneurs do not trust state institutions and the parliamentary system, they are concerned about political instability and therefore extend considerable support to authoritarian regimes. There is an also interesting phenomenon in relation to gendered economy. Central Asian women increasingly face consequences of resurgent traditionalism. The deterioration of women's educational attainments, their shrinking social liberties, and high male unemployment enhances the view that men ought to be the breadwinners of their families. However, increasing patriarchal influences are not monolithic, and they are still evolving within the context of social class, religious adherence, and cultural diversity. Despite growing gender inequality in access to economic and political power in the upper strata, women do play strong central roles in business and politics. In terms of their collective identity, entrepreneurs also show an interesting character. For almost 2 decades, Central Asian entrepreneurs hid behind their personal ties and social networks in order to handle their day-to-day affairs and address distorted law enforcement and weak institutions. In doing so, they mainly utilized their instinct for survival, combined with a deep cynicism towards the rule of law. After decades of imposed collectivization and communist ideological indoctrination, it's astonishing to see and to note that there seems to be no societal and impersonal trust for collective action beyond tribal and family lines. Now, I would like to conclude with a few remarks and highlights. But before then, I want to stress another important phenomenon in this region, and that is the moral dislocation. As they reallocated themselves from their Soviet-defined lives and experienced the whims of market forces, the entrepreneurial middle stratum went through a massive ideological and moral dislocation. The critical issue is how they accommodate the ideological dislocation they have experienced and how they shape their capitalist morals. This process has been riddled with many day-to-day moral dilemmas. I found 3 fundamental patterns of discontent related to the clash between moral preferences and the activities of entrepreneurs. These are social status anxiety, daily moral dilemmas and guilt, and the moral vacuum of post-Soviet materialism. Widespread corruption damages societal trust, whilst the Mikado Games' ruthless rounds of opportunity allocation intensifies the moral confusion. The upper strata disregard the virtues of altruism and justice in market and nation building. The corresponding societal responses for survival bring moral disarray, ranging from mimicking predatory strategies to an utopian enclosure of conservative Islam. The rise of Islam as a morally binding belief system and a social protection, in particular, an important trend in Central Asia. Now, I would like to turn to main final remarks. The analysis provided in the book suggests that 2 broad conceptual frameworks, namely the sociology of class transformation and the political economy of markets, open new avenues for researchers and policymakers. The evidence of transition from Soviet to capitalist markets point out a societal shift that occurs along with the emergence of private enterprises and new opportunity structures. The associated social stratification of this transformation corresponds to a class relocation of former Soviet classes, professional classes, in new allocation regimes. This class relocation rests on fluid value systems. Its state of flux is further exacerbated by the contested legitimacy of the state-building process. Sociological analysis of this transformation will shed light on the dynamics of stratification and the future of post-Soviet regimes. Class relocation also has broad relevance for other post-colonial and developing states where the relationship between markets and state formation could be taken further into consideration. Development economics, international relations, and political science will benefit from such an understanding of markets and their relationship to politics and society. Here we use the concept of the political economy of markets that allows for a coherent analysis of all kinds of exchanges. In this way, we can best understand how markets changed from their pre-Perestroika forms through Perestroika and into the Soviet era. There are often multiple overlapping forms characterized, for example, by the different exchange regimes and transactions associated with bazaars, cross-border trade, and oligarchic markets. Some have identifiable, spatial, and sectoral boundaries. Some are entirely abstract and permeable borders. Rather than a regime whereby market exchange is determined by a price as a signal, competition among firms, and information gathering between buyers and sellers, we can now see how the ownership of the markets shapes entry and exit, the nature of information, as well as coercion. The entrepreneurial middle stratum does not have a clear agenda for its own advancement, and given its ideological and moral paucity, it is tied to the Mikado game. The future growth of entrepreneurial middle class will contribute further to the social diversification, and this has the potential to put pressure on power concentrations and the vertical control of the market. With fragmented interests and growing alternative and multiple power bases, a diversification between the state and the market has already begun to take shape. Yet the symbiotic relationship between the layers of the Mikado game strengthens the regime's stability as entrepreneurs absorb the social costs of the reallocation rounds. For the time being, these entrepreneurs submit the deepening authoritarian state structures which work in favor of the upper strata. The Mikado game's reallocation rounds provide a degree of dynamism, and for the most part, entrepreneurs are keen to expand their business opportunities in cooperation with the upper strata. In the current state of affairs, the middle stratum is not willing to take high political risks to work against the regime's inner circle. The diverse co-option and coercion mechanisms of the upper strata discipline and punish deviance from the status quo. Many of those who tried to form opposition groups were eventually eliminated, and their punishment and exclusion dissuade many other potential contenders. However, this state of calm has been misleading, as there is continuing tension that has occasionally surfaced as open clashes. The entrepreneurial middle stratum, squeezed between wealth-controlling groups and the dispossessed, has periodically sought to change the Mikado game's order and source of political legitimacy. These rebellious entrepreneurs wanted to have more market power, and they stand opposed to the reallocation regime. In doing so, they occasionally align their interests with the dispossessed masses and mobilize them against the governments. They reach the poor and marginalized by activating bazaar politics, extending financial aid, and through social networks. Seeking fair play, justice, and accountable economic distribution unites these groups against their governments. In Uzbekistan, the government crushed all opposition groups in the country and brought stricter control to its defiant entrepreneurs, especially in the Fergana Valley. When we consider how the middle stratum affects the structure of political power elsewhere, for example, such as in Egypt and Turkey, we can see how a set of contrasting conditions can emerge. In Egypt, the middle stratum has long contributed to economic and political stability by submitting to the powers of the authoritarian upper strata. In Turkey, during the 1990s, in contrast, the middle stratum became rebellious and split. Those influenced by political Islam formed business associations, and interest groups used their democratic avenues and went on to build the foundation of the ascent in 2002 of the first stable, economically liberal, political Islamic party. Central Asian entrepreneurs could similarly either continue to submit or harness their dissatisfaction to build institutions that effectively challenge the economic and political order. So far, there are no clear indications of whether one of these situations or some other manifestation of economic pressures will emerge. Thus, we cannot easily predict whether they become a source of stability or not at this stage. What is evident is that the political support base remains fragmented both regionally and institutionally. To further necessary resources that are lacking are organizational ability and intellectual capital. Given the depletion of the Soviet-era intelligentsia, entrepreneurs seek other sources of direction and support through self-governing groups and faith-based initiatives. Middle-stratum entrepreneurs do not greatly benefit from international assistance and are in general skeptical about the sincerity and value of Western organizations in bringing democracy and fair play to their society. Hence, they do not see them as credible anchors or partners for any potential mobilization for reform as it happened in Eastern Europe. Instead, many see Western NGOs and international institutions as part of a global game between Russia and the United States. The entrepreneurial middle stratum has divided loyalties. While the Khrushchev generation is more sympathetic to Russia, younger generations see both China and Russia as threats to their national interests and economic future. The growing influence of Islam and nationalism also influenced their orientation towards other Muslim countries, most significantly towards Turkey and to a lesser extent to the Middle East. In numerous middle-class income countries, including, for example, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, and Thailand, middle classes have supported regimes based on their prospect of social mobility, their racial or ethnic identities, the power of ideological persuasion. They are otherwise inconsistent and unpredictable. In Central Asia, too, we cannot assume any direct link between an empowered middle class and democratization. To conclude, nevertheless, the support of middle class is usually essential to sustaining a future democratic governance in this region. We do need to see an empowered middle class. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll hear some comments first from Henry.
See, is this on? Yep. Great. Yeah. First of all, I just want to thank Gulberna and Blair for the invitation to speak on this panel. And I think one of the best things about that for me was it gave me a sneak peek at this terrific manuscript, which I really enjoyed a lot, and it gave me a lot of thoughts. So I think I will just talk a little bit first about where I see some of the major contributions of the book being, and then discuss a bit about how I think it might fit into a larger framework that can help us understand some of the politics in the region. So first of all, I mean, just to highlight a few of the major contributions. I mean, first of all, I think it gives us a great scholarly picture of a very important group that hasn't gotten nearly the degree of scholarly attention that it deserves, which is this class of middle entrepreneurs in Central Asia. It additionally provides us with a rich account of Central Asian political economy in a great deal of detail, which I found fascinating. And in addition, it gives us a great picture of how I think Central Asian economies really work. This isn't the language of sort of macroeconomic stability and things like that. I mean, this is a lot of detail on the nuts and bolts about who's controlling the economy, power relationships in the economy, connections to the state, the penetration of these economies in particular by families, networks of the presidents, which is an incredibly important part of what's going on. It doesn't often get reflected in works that adopt more traditional neoclassical frameworks. It even indicates, it talks a lot about what is, how important the relationships are to the state. These particularistic relationships to the state are, even in the countries that have more extensive privatization, that look like they have large private sectors on paper, such as Kyrgyzstan's. And therefore, I think it also highlights a lot of the challenges that the West faces in trying to promote greater economic development, greater development of private enterprise in societies like this. And partly for this reason, I think it fits very well in a growing literature as well, which I would say is trying to understand the workings of hybrid regimes and authoritarian systems, not just in the former Soviet space, but worldwide. And so this is where I will focus my comments, trying to locate the work a little bit and show how I think it helps us, it helps inform a framework for understanding politics in this region, and in particular a framework that I think involves understanding some of the important problems of collective action that face a lot of people and on which I think the regimes of this region depend. And I think these come out very nicely in the material that Gulburna's book provides. Now, just in the bigger picture, I think, I mean, a lot of what one sees in the book is a large degree of what one might call corruption, problems with rule of law, clientelism, patrimonialism, neo-patrimonialism, however you want to call it. And the point that I'd like to make is that I think that these things are more than simply a problem that these countries have, something that can be treated, something that if you just get the right laws in place, you can change. In fact, it seems to me that it's a much deeper thing. It's a whole syndrome of what we might call clientelism. In fact, I would even go further and say that this is a social equilibrium, in that individuals caught up in it, both at the top and at the bottom, have very little incentive to act to change it. So, of course, rulers use this pervasive corruption and the lack of a rule of law to stay in power. They co-opt people. They co-opt opposition by buying them off. They dole out corruption opportunities to try and strengthen their regime, keep people loyal. They also use these opportunities to coerce people in their own systems. I mean, this is familiar to anyone who studies machine politics, for example, in Chicago. The person that's dangerous to the system is the one who tries to operate cleanly. Because on one hand, it's the people that are buying into the corrupt system that can be manipulated, because if they ever disobey you, you can pull out the file or the pictures of them engaging in these corrupt activities. So this helps the rulers stay in power. So in fact, rulers have very little incentive to end this kind of a system. But I think what's also overlooked sometimes is that the ruled also have very little incentive at an individual level to resist this kind of a system. For example, by refusing to engage in the widespread corruption and the informal economy, one runs the risk of not being able to get anything done and being left out of economic activity or political activity. It's the payoff of what's called the sucker. And on the demand side, if one thinks about it, when states have low capacity and are simply not able to provide public goods in a comprehensive manner, there's an incentive for people to just want to jump the queue for no other reason than simply efficiency. The bureaucrats don't often have to ask for the bribe. Oftentimes it's demand from people wanting to pay off the cop rather than have to deal with court. And I think this operates at a great deal in a very pervasive way. And I think a lot of the individual entrepreneurs that Gulburna describes also seem to have very little incentive to challenge the system at an individual level. For one thing, to go out on a limb oneself to try and solve all these problems, to protest, is very risky. It rarely succeeds. It's very profitable, on the other hand, to strike up a good relationship with the authorities. That's simply the smart thing to do from a short-term business perspective. To skirt the rules, for a lot of reasons, is also very profitable. It's easier. And nepotism, the tendency to operate within one's clan, to give preferences to one's clan in business, and even the reliance on mafias can be essential for forging the kind of trust for deals and contracts necessary for business in a realm where the state doesn't provide them. And I think one of the interesting things to me, and there's some examples in here about that Gulburna talks about, how what we would consider to be, for example, abuse of funds, kind of funneling money to one's own network, is actually often, at least sometimes, part of the essential part of kind of greasing one's own network, which then enables one actually to be an effective business person, to have the networks and ties that you need in order to actually get something done and actually make a profit. And I think these things are reflected in what Goulburna calls the moral dilemmas facing these entrepreneurs. And we see, I mean, they're genuine dilemmas. And at an individual level, they're not necessarily corrupt because people are put in a position when everybody else is expected to behave in this clientelistic manner of having to choose between basically getting nothing, not helping out one's family, endangering one's family perhaps, or participating in the system. And so even though collectively everybody would be better off with strong rule of law and a lack of corruption, at an individual level, people don't have an incentive. No individual has an incentive to really stick out their neck to try and change it. It takes an unusual individual to do that, or certain kinds of situations. And so in this way, I think corruption can be seen as a collective action problem, something that's endemic. Real kind of vicious cycle, something that it's supported at both the supply and the demand level. And in that sense, I think one could think of clientelism not simply as a disease that can be treated, by certain kinds of medicines, but on the other hand, more like the life's blood of how of the body politic, exactly, in terms of how it actually works. And I think this is very important for illuminating how entrenched the problems are facing Central Asian economy, polity, and society. At the same time that I think it helps make these problems understandable in moral individual terms. In my own work, I mean, I've focused a lot on politics. So I found Goulburna's research here to be particularly interesting. I think on one hand, the documentation of the way that the state interacts with business is very, very important because it helps illustrate how when you have a president in power in a society like this, they have a tremendous amount of resources they can use to control society by manipulating business, by manipulating the entrepreneurs, basically deciding on the livelihoods of these systems thanks to this clientelistic syndrome. And I think it's, in fact, precisely this combination of formal powers delegated to presidents, mostly in the former Soviet space, and the informal powers at the intersection of state and economy that helps make these presidencies so strong and helps lead to the creation of political machines almost everywhere across the former Soviet space. And I would say it's quite striking, how you get very similar patterns, I think, despite variations on the theme across the post-Soviet countries. And just in conclusion, maybe speculating a bit on the Kyrgyz events. In fact, I may be drawing a little bit of a different conclusion from your work on what the implications are for Kyrgyzstan. Maybe we're not really disagreed, but it seems like that this. When you have what sustains these political machines, to my mind, is precisely this collective action problem. That when everybody expects everybody else to fall in line, and when the president is not giving any indication, or there's no particular reason to expect that the president is going to do anything different, nobody else in the system has an incentive to try and challenge the system. Maybe a few individuals do, but in terms of the bigger picture, it becomes very risky for anyone at lower levels to start trying to coordinate people to rise up, to coordinate business, to act against the regime, and coordination is going to be necessary for anyone to really be successful in this regard. But I think Goulburna's evidence on Uzbekistan in particular, I think, reveals this, and it was very interesting. She has surveys that she reports, where entrepreneurs in Uzbekistan are talking about how much they don't like what's going on in the system. It's pretty striking, and I imagine that's even an understatement of the real level of dissatisfaction because of the nature of the closed regime. But at the same time, the research reveals that they don't see any real good coming from the possibility of challenging the regime. But at the same time, you do get these little bursts of of outrage, or you have the Andijan uprising, for example, where there are a few attempts, but you don't get this massive rising up. And I think that's largely, because at the individual level, it's hard to imagine that they're going to be able to succeed in changing the entire system. I think that, if we turn to what happened in Kyrgyzstan, the conclusion, well, I don't know if it's a conclusion, that's a strong word, but one implication that seems to come out of this for me is that it's not necessarily the weakness of the military or the force structures or, a failure of Bakiev to, develop a strong force structure. I mean, they were able to put down other uprisings, which they were facing almost right from the beginning. But then it was that something changed at a certain point that changed the calculation of all these people who were engaged in this collective action dilemma. Something that started to get people to think that, possibly the Bakiev regime is vulnerable. And once people start to think that, maybe something can change, it cascades. It starts to spill over, in which case then it becomes much more, something that people can envision themselves doing, less risky to go out into the streets to make kind of a stand. Now, this gets us into a much deeper conversation, but my sense is that something along those lines is probably what we're talking about in Kyrgyzstan. And the one implication of that is that the evidence that you very strikingly provide on Uzbekistan suggests to me that regime might be much more fragile than we often give it credit for. That it may look strong now because people aren't seeing Karimov as likely to go away anytime soon. But if something like that should happen, or once people start to get the impression, whether due to illness or something else, that he's going to leave, what looks like a pretty unified, strong regime with strong institutions could disappear very quickly, kind of like East Germany did in 1989. So I will leave it there, and thank you for a very stimulating book.
Is this on? Okay. All right. Well, I really enjoyed this book, and I recommend it to everybody. My research is on business elites, and in particular business elites who have been part and parcel of the political regime and who joined the opposition for various reasons. So I found Gulberna's focus on entrepreneurs really refreshing. And some of the conclusions that I've been thinking about, actually, Gulberna iterated them very eloquently in this book. So because I've never participated in a panel like this before, and I was afraid that out of nervousness I'd forget what I wanted to say, I wrote out my comments, so I hope you'll bear with me. Okay, I want to start off with the things that I really like about this book. First of all, this is a thorough, well-researched, engaging, and informative read on a subject that, as Gulberna rightly states, has not received enough scholarly attention: the development, characteristics, and dilemmas of entrepreneurs and small and medium business owners in Central Asia. Many of the obstacles entrepreneurs face in Central Asia are shared throughout the post-Soviet space, as well as in developing countries with corrupt and under-institutionalized governments. That's why I think that this work's findings are likely to be applicable to other parts of the world beyond this particular region. Now, Gulberna makes a strong case that the strata of entrepreneurs, those who are sandwiched between the ruling elite that controls the most lucrative sectors of the economy and the marginalized poor who struggle to get by, deserves our attention. There's a large body of research on the post-Soviet elite, and especially on sources of conflict and elite turnover. And there's another large body that draws on surveys that gauge the attitudes of the masses. And so research, which focuses specifically on the group of business owners between these two poles, is welcome. This is not only because entrepreneurs as a distinct socioeconomic class have been understudied, but because this social stratum can both provide the regime with a source of stability and legitimacy by creating jobs and economic growth, and potentially serve as a source of unsanctioned political contestation, as Gulberna comments in her book. She convincingly depicts the multiple and diverse economic and political groupings that make up these countries. These autocratic regimes are far from monolithic, and their presidents are not the only players that we need to watch to understand how political and economic decisions are made. Instead, as Goldberner documents, there are different strata, from the president's families to the oligarchs to the apparatchiki and beyond, that all compete with one another, both within strata and between them. In fact, in key ways, politics in this part of the world is driven by such competition over scarce economic and political resources. Goldberner makes an additional contribution by devoting a chapter on the ethical and moral dilemmas business actors face on a daily basis. To survive and profit, business owners often are forced to engage in illegal activity. Now, this is not because Central Asians are more prone to immorality than are others in other places in the world, but because of the kinds of incentives and obstacles that encourage such behavior. Not enough work addresses the moral aspect of economic interactions. Goldberner's case studies and her choice of quotes from the business owners go far in putting the reader in their shoes and in bringing the dislocations and distortions that accompany the post-Soviet transition home in a vivid and human way. So in addition to the book's many important contributions, I also appreciated Goldberner's discussion of the challenges that she faced as a researcher during her field work. And how she contextualized this study in terms of her own personal history, her own personal narrative, and which led her to be interested in entrepreneurs and in Central Asia. A lot of times we think of research as such an intellectual, abstract endeavor, but Goldberner, in her preface, she does a wonderful job of explaining why it is that she's interested in this, and that really drew me in as a reader. Okay, now I have some questions. Okay, I'd like to turn to questions that came to my mind as I read through this important work. And I don't know, should I just raise them? And then if you want to answer them, you can. Okay. So first, because I'm not familiar with the Mikado game or Pick Up Sticks, I would have benefited from a more explicit treatment of its rules and assumptions and how it works. So every time there's something like a game is mentioned in research, I get nervous because I always think, oh, what if I don't understand the game? So because I'm like game challenged, I thought that maybe if you had a diagram or something or outline more clearly what the rules are, then that would have helped me. Because I understood in general where you're going, but I didn't really understand what leads to the stability and instability of the game. What creates an equilibrium and when does the game fall apart and the new game begin? So I had trouble with that one. In terms of your field work, I'd also like to know more about the kinds of non-business actors that you interviewed and how you found them. In the appendix, you note that you conducted semi-structured interviews with journalists, politicians, NGOs, and others, but I would like some more information. I'm curious about the sample of these kinds of respondents, because as experts on their countries, it seems that they'd be able to provide a lot of interesting insight. So how did you choose them, and how many were there, and how did they inform your findings and your argument? I'm also curious to hear your conclusions or speculations about larger questions that your study raises. Of these three states, which do you think has the best chances of building a solid entrepreneurial base for stable economic growth? So Kyrgyzstan's gone the farthest in implementing market reforms, but as your example of community-based tourism initiative shows, there are significant structural problems and problems with supply and demand that make it hard for the Kyrgyz economy to overcome, in order to reap the benefits of market reforms. On the other hand, Uzbeks are often called and self-described as being naturally business-oriented because of their long history as Silk Road traders, but the state's distrust of private economic activity continues to suppress this potential. Then we have Kazakhstan, where there appears to be much less animosity between business and the state. But Kazakhstan suffers from Dutch disease and dependence on natural resource extraction, which tend to stifle investment into sectors beyond the oil, gas, and mineral sectors. So each of these countries has a particular set of favorable and unfavorable conditions. Recognizing this, which do you think will fare worse or better than the others? Okay, so on a related note, how do your findings contribute to our understanding of this region's future political stability and the chances of political pluralism or political opening in what are considered some of the most authoritarian of the post-Soviet states? On the one hand, your research shows that business owners are unlikely to engage in collective action, even in Kazakhstan, where business associations are on the rise. Instead of leveraging their burgeoning economic power to challenge the political status quo, you rightly note that for the most part, entrepreneurs are keen to expand their business opportunities in cooperation with the upper strata and are unwilling to take political risks to work against the regime's inner circle. But in other places throughout the book, you point to dissatisfaction with the repressive business environment as a continuous tension that could and indeed has spilled over into protest and even violence. Seeming to suggest that this tension has political import for autocratic regimes, you describe entrepreneurs as politically ambitious, rebellious, and treacherous in their opposition to the reallocation regime. Under what conditions or scenarios might you envision the potential for collective contestation on the part of business to become activated? And second, how might this affect politics? Now, finally, this is just because of my own research interest, I found a juicy bit of information in a footnote. So in footnote 14, on your discussion of the gendered economy, you mentioned 2 cases in which entrepreneurs lost their fortunes and were physically threatened when their business interests clashed with those of 2 presidential daughters, Dariga Nazarbayeva and Gulnara Karimova. So if you have time, I'd love to hear these stories and get your take on their political significance. What do they tell us about how these economies and polities function? Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if it's on.
It's on.
It's on, okay. Well, I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to discuss your book, and I really, really enjoyed it. And actually, I had the benefit to listen to your earlier presentations at conferences, which were very helpful in my own work, too. So, again, I enjoyed reading it, and I wish I didn't have to review it in this such formal setting, because I have so many questions to you, which we should probably discuss after the presentation, after the event. Well, again, I don't want to repeat the previous discussants. This is a very important contribution to literature on Central Asia, specifically contribution to what is actually happening outside the state and in spite of the state. Because so many books are concentrating on political elites and their decisions, but as this book demonstrates, that political elites might have their own course of action, but on the grassroots level, there is still some important processes happening, which in some ways influence the political elites as well. This is a very important and interesting book. I think I'll just jump into questions right away. First of all, when you this goes along with what Barbara just said. When does entrepreneurial activity becomes political action? What are the ways? What are the tipping points? And what are the rules? What are the signs of it becoming political action? And what forms of political action? You mentioned different associations and unions or some consultancies with government representatives. But if you had to sort of list the type of political actions that entrepreneurs take, I would be really interested in knowing those. Second, when it comes to at least Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, I find that NGO employees were an important part of the middle class, emerging middle class. And I have to say, once being part of an NGO community, they are pretty entrepreneurial, and they do seek for foreign investment. And they are the ones who take a political action. And they also become, from just being NGOs, very often they become into private institutes and some sort of type of businesses in the country. And this leads me to another question. Your sample, you mentioned that over half of those who you interviewed were women, and most of them were urban and educated. And you also mentioned that you used the data provided by EBRD, and I understand the limits of the fieldwork in Central Asia. Though I'm really interested, could it be that EBRD does include mostly women and urban and educated population in its system and its sample, because, as you mentioned, those are the people who received microgrants from EBRD, and you also say that it's a you use snowball effect, and you kind of use your respondents to obtain further contacts. But I was a little. It was very interesting to see that. So many entrepreneurs are so educated and have professional backgrounds. When it comes to Moral Man, and I enjoyed the chapter on Moral Man very much. I really this particular chapter was familiar to me from your previous talks, and I learned a lot from it. Though I noticed something very, very interesting. You talk about moral man, and half of your sample are women, and there is never
Answer to that.
Okay, good. There is not a single case description of a woman. How would she deal with those moral dilemmas in this particular context? So this is just on a side note, and forgive me for being so picky about things. Again, this comes from my curiosity in your work. And not being an economist and not really being familiar with game theory, I have a question about Mikado game. It seems like, at least to me, in my own perception, it seems like those 5 different strata of society that you described, the presidents, the civil servants, oligarchs, etc., they do interact, but their interaction is limited. The entrepreneurs, the middle class entrepreneurs, they don't trust the state. Their votes are not counted. They're not represented. When the taxation policy is ineffective, they don't trust. They don't use courts. So what is it really? What are the types of relationships are there? What is it how is the game actually played? You did mention that, for instance, a local governor would demand some extra bribes in order to please the central government. So again, it would be really interesting to know what are these type of informal relations outside the state, outside this taxation system, outside elections. What are these types of practices? What is the interaction? What are the informal institutions, I would say? And this leads me to thinking, and again, I might be completely inadequate here, but could it be that Mikado game is actually played on different levels? So there are multiple Mikado games inside each state. That there is a Mikado game among oligarchs, maybe interactive with presidents, with civil servants, and then there is another Mikado game on a bazaar level, and among underprivileged. And this is I'm just very curious in this. And again, could there be that there is a Mikado game that trespasses state borders? For instance, Karasu Bazaar, where you have different authorities, different power bases, and it's also divided ethnically. And again, this leads me to yet another question. Did you notice any ethnic stratification among entrepreneurs? For instance, the common bias, the common prejudice is that the Chinese do this and that, the Dungans do this and that. There is little, even though large part of your sample were Slavic people with, how do you say that, ethnic Russian and ethnic Ukrainians, yet they're not included into this description of moral man. And also, they're not. I wonder if there is, or maybe this is just a prejudice, that there is a stratification according to ethnicities. And what does this tell us about Central Asian states and the power relations in Central Asian states? So the last thing I want to point out is. Actually, no, this is it. So I think I have collected a pretty long list of questions, and if you can't answer them now, maybe a little later. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Gul, maybe we'll give you a chance to try to answer all the questions. Yes, briefly. Briefly. I have a clock.
Another book. Well, thank you all. I really enjoyed hearing your assessment of my work. It gives me a great privilege to hear that you, by and large, I think by consensus, liked it, found it interesting, and that's really very important to me and valuable. I really thought that Henry opened a new avenue for us to think about in terms of what is the tipping point in relation to accommodating a status quo and versus toppling it down. What is the really fragile point to do so? And I think, as you rightly pointed out, Uzbekistan, in my view, is the most fragile state, that the current calm and obedience is perhaps highly misleading. If something goes wrong there, we will see a similar, in my view, much more bloody, I hope not, but it looks like, upheaval and regime change in Uzbekistan, because I don't think that the Karimov regime will go away peacefully. I don't think that's at all likely. Barbara, you addressed few aspects and questions in relation to my work. Actually, Erica, you asked similar questions. Maybe I put them together. One important issue is the Mikado game itself, how I conceptualize it, whether it's clear enough. And second issue is about my empirical data, how I gathered my evidence. So let me say a few things about that. The Mikado game is an analogy I came up with, because neither authoritarian state concept nor clanism or regional power building in center-periphery relationship explained my concerns and my people, middle-class entrepreneurs. Rather, again and again, I realized that there is actually a game going on here. And that game is based on reallocation and redistribution of assets. Some of them are former state-owned enterprises, the Soviet-era assets. Some of them are new ones, like the bazaars. Bazaars did not exist during the Soviet era. These are new assets. And those assets are being allocated, not permanently, but periodically, to be reallocated again. And indeed, that dynamism is perhaps the most critical element why many entrepreneurs prefer to remain loyal. Because those reallocation and allocation rounds, if they are successful, generate new opportunities and new hopes for entrepreneurs. That's why I really thought that only a game. I'm not really macroeconomist. I'm familiar with game theory, but I also noticed that some other economists have used that kind of game theory in order to explain how in a society different groups accumulate wealth and interest, and how it in fact affects the regime and the stability or instability and the type of democracy different societies have. That's why I use the concept of the Mikado game. The essential part of this game is that if you are familiar with the pickup sticks, it's a game whereby you have different rounds. And each round has to have certain rules. The version that more sophisticated version has 5 different groups. There's a king, there's the ordinary citizen, and in between different groups, and those don't actually match the ones in Central Asia. Mandarin, for example, we don't have Mandarin anymore in real sense. But whereas using the Soviet era concepts, some of the Marxist concepts I thought would fit better to explain these different groups. Maybe we can actually think a lot more about the Mikado game and come up with perhaps sub-games within the game, as you suggested. But I did not think about it when I was writing the book and thinking about these different groups being part of a reallocation game, because I do see not necessarily interdependence, but a permanent link between the impoverished masses and the upper strata, because they do distribute wealth and opportunities and resources in a trickle-down effect to also dispossessed people. So in my view, everybody is part of the same game rather than being part of different games. As I said, there are lateral issues in the Mikado Games dynamics, that it happens among protégés, among courtiers, it happens among the entrepreneurial groups. But overall, I think it is one game, one big game with different complexities and sub-interests and interest-based politics as well, of course. I hope that explains a bit what I tried to do. In terms of my survey, yes, this was a long survey, a difficult experience in many ways. The reason I chose the EBRD program in 2004 because it was the only way to have access to entrepreneurs without being subject to suspicion or any other form of surveillance. It has an important dimension, though, because EBRD microfinance program, which started quite a long time ago, was most pervasive, most successful in these three countries when I started doing my survey. And entrepreneurs who were able to use microfinance were the real middle-class entrepreneurs, of course, because if you are trading a few items, you wouldn't go by microfinance. You only get microfinance if you are able to repay it back. That's why I thought that it is important to use that form, that access, because it did define, to me, urban, middle-class, entrepreneurial stratum. That's why I have high educational attainments. That's why I have a reasonably good gender balance. But although if you go to other rural small towns and communities, I think you equally see a high representation of female entrepreneurs in different economic activities, although it depends. Now, the EBRD set was useful because it made me feel that I could use that template to select entrepreneurs, which I did. So I went to typically local branches, had bank consultants who prepared a list for me. So among that list, I was able to choose. I didn't disclose in the book, but on that list, I was able to see also the amount of credit they got from the bank. But because it's a personal data, I didn't use in my book. However, that process was difficult in Kazakhstan and extremely hard to do in Uzbekistan. Since I had problems in these countries, I had to do additional surveys through semi-structured interviews. I was explaining to one of our friends here who knows the realities of Uzbekistan better than I do, it was extremely hard to do survey in the aftermath of the Andijan events. And therefore, in Uzbekistan, I had to carry out semi-structured interviews with 30 or so artisans in the Fergana Valley. How did I have access to these people? Well, I had some contacts who were students in London or in the region. Over the years, I developed these links. One contact is here, who has been instrumental to Alisher, may I name your name, to get me in touch with some locals in Uzbekistan who helped me to reach to the artisanal association in the Fergana Valley. And the representative of the artisanal association, knowing that I'm doing a survey on artisans, were very happy to take me around. I don't think I betrayed them. I was honest that I was doing a survey, but I was honest also to reflect the fact that entrepreneurs in the Fergana Valley were very unhappy. They felt suppressed. They felt that they were subject to unfair treatment by their state. So empirical survey was, as I said, long, eclectic in many ways. I had lots of different contacts in New York, in Istanbul, in financial circles. In London, as I said, EBRD was instrumental. I, over the years, built good contacts at KIMAP, which is a management university in Almaty. I had good contacts with Manas University in Bishkek, and then American University in Central Asia. So all these contacts, which developed over the years, were all very important and instrumental for me to have access to entrepreneurs. So I had these different entry points to the lives of ordinary people and entrepreneurs in the region, which I tried to exploit as much as I could. Maybe I should say a few things about moral men, not moral women. Well, I'm currently writing a journal article on this issue of morality and entrepreneurship. And this is my observation after talking to more than 200 entrepreneurs in different forums. I realized that women took it as part of their survival. That's always what they did. They didn't care about whether it was too moral or immoral, because they knew that they were responsible for the survival of their children, their communities. Therefore, they didn't necessarily address the issue of their moral dilemmas, whereas men were more vocal and more concerned about these moral dilemmas. Now, this is an empirical finding that we need to test in other circumstances. I'm not sure whether this is just a bias of my survey, or there is something biological and evolutionary in the perceptions of women in relation to survival and economic activities versus men. Similarly, a similar evolution in relation to philosophizing about actions in philosophical terms, whether women really, naturally, they were not theological leaders, they were not the leaders of the major religions, that they perhaps did not have the language of that kind of thinking, that kind of morality, although today in gender equality women talk about all these issues, but it is not in our moral evolutionary development to think about religion as philosophers of religion. How many female philosophers we have in the history of humankind talking about religious theology and so I think this is something that we can discuss further. Basically, in my sample, men were more concerned, more paralyzed by their moral standing in the society than women. Women were less expressive, let me say. What else?
Leave it there.
Yeah, perhaps, and then we will continue further.
Well, I want to open it up, but I as you were speaking, Gul, I was taken back to when I read Plato with Alan Bloom, a Straussian political philosopher, when I was in graduate school in the University of Toronto, and he used to hold forth. This is a different time, and Alan Bloom, who became somewhat well known for the Closing the American Mind, was the name of a book he wrote. Alan Bloom would make the point that women are a lesser being because they're incapable of philosophy. So when I
didn't say that.
I'm wondering if there might actually be a middle ground. That this doesn't have much to do with biology, but it does have to do with role definition and culture. And I have heard people speculate that Russian women in post-Soviet transitions also have been more adaptive for exactly the same reason. And I'm wondering if you might want to speculate a little bit about how the Soviet Union functioned and the role of women in actually making the system work, while the men sat around in management offices and party meetings and not exactly philosophizing, but being arguably irresponsible. Well, it was the women in every institution that made it work, and that, in fact, what you may be describing here is something of one of those potential shadows of the Soviet experience, which would be very interesting to explore. So I'll just toss that out. Floor is open over here.
My name is Umida. I recently moved from Uzbekistan, did some research back in my country. My first question to Gulberna. So when you were doing surveys and went to talk to entrepreneurs, and you said that they expressed they were unhappy about the judiciary and corruption, weren't they afraid to say that, oh, you had to assure of
Anonymity.
Anonymity to them, because especially in Uzbekistan, it's easier to track down who were criticizing the government and then do something to this people. How you think how much sincere they were when they were when you were interviewing, and then my second question is, did you notice that this entrepreneurs, especially I'm talking about Uzbekistan, are getting more and more fundamental? Because in my observation, the more money the entrepreneurs have, the more they become fundamental, and they follow Islam, and they try to then convert all the family and wife and children and relatives. What was your observation? And there's one comment on to Henry about you said that if there's it will be known that the Karimov is kind of sick and is going to step down, there will be forces to actually move country and change the power. Well, we have the gossips that the Karimov is sick and for already 5 years or more, and really, it's like on all levels, like on his administration level and all the citizens level, that he's cancer, some cancer in the brain, and he's going to die soon. But for some reason, it's not moving people, citizens, to kind of change the situation in the government. So I think it's much stronger. He's much stronger than the. Thank you.
Yes. There is a chapter on women, so I can defend that I took them seriously. And it is about gendered economy, and there is a section on how the Soviet-era women were powerful in taking important roles in household bartering, in economic activities, and how the Soviet system absorbed the male pride and made men shiftless in some respects. So definitely there is a link and certain continuity in those norms and beliefs. Yes, my survey was anonymous. I never asked people's names. In some cases I knew it. As I said, I didn't even use the amount of money they borrowed from the banks. They were comfortable when we were in private settings. And many conversations actually took place in their homes. And I described in the book, sometimes after drinking tea, sometimes after food. And when they relaxed, when they felt confident and feeling that I wasn't writing anything or there was no other outsider, they were quite, in my view, honest to express their concerns and displeasure. So I don't think during my survey, especially before the Andijan event, there was such a strong fear when they talked about their discontent. Because remember, presidents often distance themselves from judiciary, from the wrongdoings of the parliaments as well. That's why they keep periodically sacking prime ministers and change the senators, because they say, well, these are terrible, corrupt. They don't run the government as I wish. So people feel relatively at ease when they talk about these things because they know that their president is being conscious and concerned about it too. So fundamentalism, yes, there is definitely increasing influence of Islam. Islam is becoming the source of a new moral economy as entrepreneurs try to insulate themselves from the workings of the alternative markets. Islam is also becoming a kind of tool for political mobilization. At the moment, it is controlled, strongly controlled. And sometimes that actually, in my view, fuels extremism because excessive repression makes people think even further in terms of resulting to use violence. So there is definitely that trend. Money is important. Money makes friends, and these entrepreneurs, as I said, are building their networks by trading with each other, by forming solidarity networks among each other, and binding rule is a moral code of Islam. That's how they start trusting each other and doing business, thinking that they will not be cheated by their co-religionists or the co-Muslims. So it is certainly an interesting trend, and most notably in the Fergana Valley, there is a stronger influence of Islam, but it also is quite visible in Kyrgyzstan as well as in Kazakhstan. Now, there's nothing wrong with it. These people have been Muslims for quite a long time, but they were in dark. They didn't know how to practice Islam during the Soviet era. The issue now is that there are competing modes of Islam in the region that's being exported by outsiders. And they are quite perceptive to understand these different groups and their way of preaching. So it is a phenomenon which is also affected by the diffusion of outside interests in the region.
I mean, just very briefly, yes. I mean, that's why I mentioned the illness, is because there have been these rumors going around for quite a while. And so, the question is if they become kind of more acute. But, I mean, I think one advantage that Uzbekistan has over the others is that it isn't a hybrid regime. I mean, it's very much an authoritarian regime. And so there, the dynamics are a little different than in Uzbekistan. But I think kind of all other things equal, it becomes more vulnerable to these kind of external or just internal shocks. Just collective action becomes easier to the extent that there's a desire for it. And so that's what I meant. So thanks.
Well, and then we'll go over here.
Gulburna, I have some questions about the use of the term entrepreneur, because the term itself carries such positive connotations in the West of kind of being innovative and risk takers and providing services that that aren't necessarily provided. How is the term entrepreneur perceived in these societies? Is it perceived as something being positive? Or, as you might have suggested, is it perceived by being crooks, or is it seen by being too closely aligned to the state and the services that they provide? So I'm curious how entrepreneurs are viewed by society as a whole. And I'm also interested in how they view themselves. In the United States, you talk about serial entrepreneurs. People are quite happy to constantly be an entrepreneur. Is being an entrepreneur in these regions kind of a path to getting into the elite, or are they satisfied with kind of maintaining that as their status and occupation?
Well, since it is not a real open form of capitalism, entrepreneur as term and also as individual really doesn't have a corresponding concrete image in the minds of people. People do business to carry on with their lives, to provide income to their families. Therefore, it is not that's why I try to explain in the book, it is not a consciously formed identity. It's neither a class nor a position of a market player at the moment. The situation might change. But what is interesting is that entrepreneurs who are wealthy are increasingly becoming social providers. Therefore, they actually have respect and followers. And combined with sometimes Islam, this becomes a respected public position. And they enjoy it, they value it. Indeed, I was in Kyrgyzstan in November for 3 weeks, and this time I talked to people in relation to doing business and incorporating Islam into their belief system. And I met some people who have established informal charitable activities. So they built mosques, they built schools, they give money to the poor. So they become social entrepreneurs as well as entrepreneurs in the sense of being a market player. But I don't think we should associate entrepreneurship as always a positive phenomenon. And I think entrepreneurship can be destructive and can be damaging to a society as well. So that's why I talk about self-governing groups, drug and illicit trade. Those are entrepreneurs too. And they indeed harm their economies and abuse human resources at the same time. So there are many different entrepreneurs. And to me, I think innovative and progressive interpretation of entrepreneurship is a very narrow approach. So I don't associate entrepreneurs always with good things.
We'll go over here next, and then I have a couple of people here. We'll come to you. We're getting you a microphone right now.
Hi, Bill Veal from the U.S. Kazakhstan Business Association. I had a comment first and then a question for you that the two are not exactly related. I had an opportunity to speak with a woman who was very active in women's activities in small business in Kazakhstan recently. And she said that 80% of the small businesses in Kazakhstan are headed by women. And that when you get to when those businesses start to grow, those women will often turn that business over to men, family relatives or otherwise, because the going gets tough, and they find that it's not easy as a woman to sort of navigate what has to be done when you get to a certain level in the business. So I thought that was kind of an interesting kind of observation in this gender aspect that you were dealing with. The question I have has to do with, I think you made a reference to rule of law in your initial presentation here. In a country like Kazakhstan, and this is probably true of a lot of the others, the legal landscape is cluttered with the fact that these are economies in transition. There's a lot of legislative debris, so to speak, across the landscape. And there are a lot of different loops and catch-22s out there. And this seems to become part of the system as a way of tripping people or having a potential hook on an entrepreneur, for example, so that almost anything you do is against some law. And it is the selective use and application of that law by somebody who may not like what you're doing is going to point out that you're transgressing against such and such a little wrinkle, and that becomes the hook which disciplines you back. It puts you back in your place, in other words. Did you encounter this yourself in your surveys there?
Thank you. Yes, I am quite interested and not at all surprised by the findings that women later on turn to men to basically deal with certain market issues or uncertainties. And it's also interesting to see that women really take up entrepreneurship more frequently than men, which is interesting. Rule of law is such a misused term in this geography. You know, people talk about their desire to live in an orderly and well-governed country, but they systematically abuse these laws themselves. So it's the same issue that Henry was talking about. It's pervasive corruption. It's part of that behavioral norm. But laws, some of them are the Soviet-era statutes. Some of them are recent changes, and under the constant reconstruction, create deep confusion for even judiciary because they don't know how to interpret these laws. There are so many old rules about, for example, inspections. You know, suddenly fire brigade comes to inspect your office because they found somewhere that, you know, every trade site has to be inspected.
It's a criminal, not a civil violation.
Exactly. And then, you know, how you can get away with it if they find any excuse to charge or to fine you. So you can't get away with that. You pay bribes in order to kind of have this peace of mind. So it is used, abused, and constantly redone. It is a body of structure that's not going to be complete until there is a certain stability and common agreement by the state and people to obey by the law.
Okay, I still have 3 people. I have 4 people. We have about 15 minutes left, so let's all keep that in mind. We'll go here, and we'll move across the room, and then go to the back.
Thank you. I'll try to be really quick. Maria Vasilyeva from Georgetown University. And my question has to do with middle class and sort of conceptualizing middle class, because it seems to be like such a difficult concept to deal with. Is it sort of financially based? Is it education based? You mentioned already sort of, I guess, partially touched on that question, that you looked at the microfinance loans. But sort of part of the middle class is that it's sort of not impoverished and it has some sort of economic security to become then a politically important stratum, etc. But partially it's also normative as well. I assume, I'm sure you had to deal with some of these issues, and sort of how you encountered that when you did your surveys, when you sort of were out in the field, how you dealt with that. That would be interesting to me. And also, how big is it? Sort of how big of a middle entrepreneurial class are we talking about? Because sort of right now, I'm looking at middle class in Russia and sort of some of the similar questions as part of my dissertation, and sort of trying to navigate some of this very difficult terrain conceptually. And I just was curious to see what you have to say about that.
Why don't we try to get David in as well?
Yes, I'm David Abramson from the State Department. And I just wanted to, you mentioned the fragility, what you perceived as the fragility of the Uzbek, of Karimov's regime. And I just wanted to see how you would comment by looking through the lens of your game framework at 2 campaigns that have been undertaken by the Karimov regime over the last approximately 8 months. The last 8 months. One is a targeting of 2 different groups that you talk about. One is the oligarchs, and who have been arrested, and I would call that more of a shakedown that has occurred since December. The other one is a targeted arrest in the secret trials of quite a number of throughout the country, but as far as I know, less so, not so much in the Fergana Valley, of small-scale businessmen from bazaars, entrepreneurs, who are predominantly have a more religiously observant. And I don't have a scientific way of assessing this, but that's my impression. So I'm just wondering, in targeting that, what is the how would you assess the Karimov's the regime's response? Is it an act of desperation, or is it just another in response to a threat that that they perceived increasing perhaps sometime in the past year, maybe last summer, or is it just a periodic use of trying to redistribute, reallocate, take resources out of sectors that are potentially threatening, but also targeting those perhaps budding Crimea, Andijan-like business collectives throughout the country?
Thank you. Yes, how big is this middle class? Well, middle class, as I said, is a squeezed group of people between impoverished masses and the upper strata. Obviously, compared to impoverished masses, they are far smaller, but they are far bigger, let me say this way, than the upper strata. It is an evolving phenomenon. It's like an accordion. It actually expands when there are business opportunities. More fair allocation happens more successfully in Kazakhstan, in my view, to answer your question, a most successful country in the region, in all kind of assessments that I can describe if you are interested. I don't want to give a number, but the critical issue is that this is class. I call it a class, or I call it a social group. They don't feel like they are part of a class. That's why I call it as a class relocation. These people were mostly Soviet-era managers, workers, teachers. Most of them were Soviet-era middle classes. Those middle classes relocated themselves in the market. Therefore, it is very fluid. It's very, very changing phenomenon. So I don't want to describe them in static terms. I hope
The reason why I asked is because it's such a broad category that has very different preferences based on the kind of entrepreneurship we look at, which I assume would have some sort of a repercussion on analyzing them in theoretical terms because their preferences are different in dealing with the elites, in making certain choices within the Mikado structure.
Yes.
So that's just what was interesting to me. How to
So,
deal with that.
yeah, definitely there is room for a lot more research on this, especially also in terms of ethnicity. One thing I want to emphasize is that despite lots of ethnic slurs in the region about Russians, about Uzbeks, about other people against each other, entrepreneurs come from many different backgrounds. There is no strong association about one particular group being more entrepreneurial than the other. That's really important finding, in my view, of this survey. However, there are certain areas mostly occupied and owned by certain entrepreneurs in certain segments of the bazaar, certain trade. For example, Uyghurs have a lot of trade with Urumqi, with China, so they have certain ways of trading and doing business. Similarly, Koreans, ethnic Koreans or Russians, so there are those differences, but there is not a strong ethnic difference in entrepreneurial traits. In terms of what's happening in Uzbekistan, I think I am not, of course, I haven't been back to Uzbekistan for during past 2 years, so my understanding of events is certainly limited. However, I think this is one of the periodic purges that Mikado game has to have in order to continue its own rounds of reallocation defined by the upper strata. However, as I said in the book, it's a very deceitful game too. Oligarchs who were good friends of Karimov might be killed next day in the sense that when circumstances change, when the regime sees a power base being developing and forming an opposition, there is no hesitation. They eliminate. And there are, as I said, there are different forms of elimination. So oligarchs certainly are subject to those purges as well. It's not a privilege to be an oligarch. Oligarchs and ruling families have very symbiotic relationship, but also very deceitful relationship. Same applies to the ruling families as well. But in terms of the Akramiya and the religious groups, they are really a different form of threat to this regime, because they are the ones who have potential to become strong challengers coming from the bottom up. And that is much more dangerous and often difficult to pin down, especially if it is not regionally concentrated. That's why Uzbekistan has this extensive secret police and security officers stationed in daily lives as civilians in order to detect these things in the society. So it is part of the periodic purges. It's also part of the process of protecting the upper strata interests in the economy. So obviously there are new oligarchs who will replace those punished ones, and the game will continue. Maybe there are foreign investors. Obviously foreigners are part of this game as well. So it's not just a domestic game. That's the answer to your question.
Okay, let's get the final two questions in right here and then in the very back. Right here, Joe.
My name is Deirdre Lepin. I'm an Africanist and a former Woodrow Wilson scholar. I was in Gould's class last year. We had a lot of interesting discussions. I was fascinated by this panel because I perceived two big registers of understanding of this region with which I am not very familiar. One, which was described by Henry, which is the clientelist, almost immutable, intractable clientelist systems in which individuals don't stick their necks out and in which they become absorbed in these dilemmas of individual will and able to exercise a need to act on another mode of operation, but which one that they feel they cannot exercise in this particular system. And Gould's fascinating analogy with the Mikado game, the pick-up sticks game, in which there is, in fact, an opening of individual opportunity through skill and also through chance, of being able to redistribute assets, and yet at the same time having to hang on to those assets through systems of enforcement, such as security, hiring young militias or thugs or whatever, in order to build up and shore up the power relationships that develop from these new opportunities. So it's reconciling these two visions. The first one I'm very familiar with in Africa. The second one I think is much more subtle and more interesting. And how would you reconcile them?
And then we'll get the final question in the very back, Joe.
I have 3 questions. The first one, it's about, you mentioned the effects of Islamic nationalism over the entrepreneurship in Central Asia, and I'd like to know, is it positive or negative, and how? If you could provide me with some examples. The other thing, you mentioned that there is extremely controlled of political Islam, and I'd like to know how they are controlling that. The third question is about, you mentioned relationship between corruption and informal economy, and I'd like to know what's the link between the two, or what's the relation between them, and what's the good mechanisms to move or to transform from informal economy to formal economy, so we can bridge the gap of corruption. Thank you.
I was thinking whether Henry would like to say something about Deirdre's point, because it has a reference to your...
Okay, yeah, thanks. I'll be very brief. I mean, I guess I don't see them as being in tension at all. It's just a matter of kind of the system in which people work, but system where you have this sort of collective action problem. What the problem is making the transition from operating that way and not operating that way. But once you're operating that way, there's lots of opportunity for people. I mean, there's some great examples from even Russian history, of like townspeople throwing out their own representatives because they weren't corrupt enough in being able to use their opportunities to kind of fight for their district and to get resources. So it can be a certain kind of empowerment for ordinary people as well. I guess I didn't see a contradiction there in that sense. And then just very briefly, in terms of the connection between the informal economy and corruption, I mean, that's sort of a long, a long story. But I think partly by definition, I mean, informal economy, it may be an economy outside the rules, but often it's an economy that operates, exactly what Bill Veal was saying earlier about, when you have a system of rules that's almost designed to force the economy not to abide by formal laws, then it's almost by definition corrupt. And then that becomes used by the authorities, who can then selectively prosecute and maintain their own political power. So it's not informal economy is not necessarily corrupt, but in practice, at least in this part of the world that we're talking about here, I think it very often is. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I don't think I can answer all these questions, but Deirdre's point is something we have to think about. How to actually combine these clientelist behavioral norms and the Mikado games reallocation rounds and its mechanisms. Maybe we should work on a paper together. Final mark about Islamic Opposition, well, there is no formal opposition in these countries. All of the supposedly opposition movements are either controlled by the ruling party, ruling leaders, or they are in exile. So obviously there is not an open system for democratic participation or representation. Maybe I should stop here. We can talk informally if you would like to ask more questions.
Well, it is time to come to a close, and I think it's a good sign that we're coming to a close with notions of future papers dancing in our heads. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that this is really a remarkable book, and I hope that that has emerged both in her presentation and her responses to the comments. And I know that it's outrageously expensive, but it is available outside, and I would urge all of you with a serious interest in the region to consider purchasing it, and certainly to read it. It's a remarkable piece of research, and I think it points in very fruitful directions for future research for everybody in the field. And I think that's the best thing that can be said about a book. So I mean it as a high compliment. So thank you all for coming, and thank all the speakers. And we'll see you for the next book.